Everyone, and welcome to our week on experiments, or really advanced research methods. And experiments is one of the methods. So for today, we're going to be talking about observational versus experimental data, the fundamental concepts of experiments, and then finally we'll look at the example from our reading from Condon and Wachowski. So we have two types of data that we typically use in political science. The first is observational, and the observational data means you do not have control over values of your independent variables. So you only get to observe what is happening. That's why it's called observational, everyone. You get to observe what is happening and how people are behaving in the world, but you yourself as the researcher have no control over the independent variables. Okay, just like this person on a safari they're watching from afar and not interfering. Okay, they're merely observing. Most of our data in political science, public policy, and even public administration is largely observational. We have had a recent turn in the past 5 or 10 years towards survey experiments, but most of our analyses are still regressions, right, with using observational data. It is not necessarily a survey experiment. And so that is what is most common. Make sure you check out that regression video if you haven't yet, because it's super, super important for work in our field. But with observational data, it means that we as researchers have to include a lot of controls, right? Remember, with our regression video, we would have incorrect estimates, which would be bad, if we are not including all of the relevant independent variables that likely shape the dependent variables, right? If we are unable to control for all possible independent variables that affect the dependent variable, that means that our estimates for our regression are biased or incorrect, okay? Now, we also have this other kind of data in political science, in public policy, and public administration called experimental data. And experimental data means that I, as the researcher, or we as our research team, we have control over values of your independent variables, right? Now, experiments are very often done in the hard sciences, so chemistry, biology, engineering, because it's easier to have full control over the subject or the project's independent variables. So for instance, if I'm studying animals, right, I can control their diet, I can control their environment, and then I can expose them to maybe a certain exercise regimen, right, and see how that exercise regimen affects their lifestyle. That's much more difficult to do with people, right? Because people are doing all kinds of things that I have no control over, okay? People are eating whatever they want. People are running as much as they want, right? I don't have control over those independent variables. Whereas with animal studies, which there are a lot of ethical concerns about, there's much more control over the independent variables, okay? Now, the first condition of experiments, though, is that you have control over the value on the main independent variable. So my example from earlier, right, I can't have control over everything when it comes to political behavior, right? I can't control, like in my example from running, or like health outcomes, I can't control everything that they're doing. But if I can control the thing that is most relevant to my theory and hypothesis, right? That's really important, okay? So in this case, researchers, me, you, are determining what the value on the independent variable is for every participant, okay? That is, people are not deciding for themselves what the value is, right? If I was talking about that like exercise and health example with people, I would be randomly assigning them different exercise regimens, right? So you run 0 minutes per week, you run 30 minutes per week, you run 2 hours per week, and I'm assigning the treatment, right? But they are not deciding, okay? They don't get to opt for it. It is me assigning that independent variable, that treatment to them, okay? The second condition is that it is a random assignment. Okay, that it is a random assignment of values for the independent variable. So that essentially creates experimental groups. So the people who receive the treatment and those people who receive the placebo. You are likely familiar with this concept from medical studies, right? Some people receive the treatment, the actual pill, right? And then some people receive the placebo, the sugar pill, which doesn't do anything. Okay, and then they compare the outcomes of the two groups. But random assignment ensures that both groups are entirely similar on all independent variables except for the one controlled by the researcher. Okay, so random assignment, if you recall, random means that everyone has an equal likelihood of being selected for either group, right? So if I'm assigning to treatment or placebo, everyone has a 50-50 chance of being given treatment or placebo. Okay, and theoretically, if my random assignment goes correctly, it ensures that both groups are similar with respect to other characteristics, except for the one that's controlled by me, whether they received the placebo or whether they received the treatment. Okay, as an example, let's say if any of you have ever played the classic Guess Who game, this is the original one, not the one from the last 10 or 15 years. And I'm assigning these participants into the treatment group and the control group, right? And I'm assigning them using a coin flip, right? So I'm going to get heads, you get into the treatment group, you get tails, you get into the control group, okay? Now, let's say I did the first one, heads, Alex got heads, and so he is going into the heads group. Okay, and then I did it again for Alfred and he got into the tails group. And then I do this for each individual. Okay, and what you can see, they're now divvied out. We have Alex, Bernard, Bill, Claire, David, George, Susan, right? All of these here in the heads group. Then we have Alfred, Anita, Anne, Charles, right? All in the tails group. Now, by randomizing assignments, we should have similar characteristics between the two groups, which allows us to control for alternative explanations, okay? So for instance, we have a similar number of hats in both groups. This group has 3 hats, right? And this group has 2 hats. We also have a similar number of women in both groups. We have 3 women in the heads group, and we have 2 women in the tails group. We also have a similar number of beards in each group, right? We have 2 in the heads group, and we have 2 in the tails group. And then finally, we have a similar number of glasses in both groups. The heads group has 2 glasses, right? Claire and Sam. And the tails group has 3 glasses, Joe, Paul, and Tom. Okay. But by randomizing it, heads and tails for each person, I had no control, right? I wasn't like, Claire's getting heads because I think she needs heads, right? It was a random coin flip, right? That assigned her there. Okay, and so this balances out and controls for all of the other possible alternative explanations that might affect our dependent variable. This is particularly important when we're talking about survey experiments. You would want an even balance of, say, men and women, right? Like in each group. You would want a similar proportion of low income and high income people. You would want a variety you would want each group, both the treatment and the placebo group, to have similar characteristics on average. That way you're controlling for those characteristics, but you have to do that through random assignment. Okay, now I can give each of my groups a treatment. So I can give them the heads group is going to watch a candidate's political ad. That's the treatment. And the tails group is going to get to watch an episode of The Simpsons. That's the placebo. And you might be thinking, what a weird example. This is quite common for political consultants, is they'll take 2 groups of people, show one group the political ad for the candidate, and then show the other group an episode of TV. And then at the end, they're going to assess for both groups whether they're whether each of those groups change their political attitudes towards the candidate, and that's the dependent variable. And this is actually a real example that we've had students participate, like not in this department, but they have done focus groups elsewhere where some of them were in the control group and some of them were receiving this treatment where they got to watch political ads from the candidate and then were asked, what did you think of the candidate? Okay. So this is an example of an experiment, right? The heads group got to see the political ad, right? And then the tails group got to watch TV. And then afterwards they were asked, what do you think of the candidate? And so the tails group is our control, right? They are our placebo. They didn't get to watch the content. The heads group is our treatment group, right? They got the manipulation. And so afterwards, I'm going to ask all of them, both in the heads group and the tails group, what did you think of this political candidate? And we'll get to see whether that ad helped improve people's attitudes towards the candidate, whether it had no effect, or maybe whether it had a negative effect, right? You've all seen political ads before. Not all of them are great. Now, an example from your reading from Condon and Wachowski, they ask people to compare themselves to different rungs of the income ladder. So I'm going to show you the first treatment, and then I'm going to show you the second treatment, and then I'll show you what outcomes they were interested in. But these are the treatments. So it says, now please compare yourself to the people at the very bottom of the ladder. These are the people who are worst off, or who are the worst off. Those who have the least money, least education, and the least respected jobs. In particular, we'd like you to think about how you are different from these people in terms of your own income, educational history, and job status. Where would you place yourself on this ladder relative to these people at the very bottom? Please select a number on the grid below representing rungs of the ladder, with 10 representing the top rung and 1 representing the bottom rung. So this is low income on the ladder, 1, and 10 is high income. Now imagine yourself in a getting acquainted interaction with one of the people you just thought about from the ladder. Think about how the differences between you might impact what you would talk about, how the interaction is likely to go, and what you and the other person might say to each other. How comfortable do you think you would have felt in the interaction you have imagined? Please write 1 to 5 sentences describing your feelings about the interaction you have imagined. Okay, so that's the first treatment. Okay, they said, look down, look at the bottom of this ladder, and imagine that you're having a social interaction with someone lower on the income scale. Okay, now here is the other treatment. Please compare yourself to the people at the very top of the ladder. These are the people who are the best off. Think of those who have the most money, most education, and the most respected jobs. In particular, we'd like you to think about how you are different from these people in terms of your own income, educational history, and job status. Where would you place yourself on this ladder relative to these people at the very top? Please select a number on a grid below representing rungs of the ladder, with 10 representing the top rung and 1 representing the bottom rung. Now imagine yourself getting acquainted interaction with one of the people you just thought about from the ladder. Think about how the differences between you might impact what you would talk about, how the interaction is likely to go, and what you and the other person might say to each other. How comfortable do you think you would have felt in the interaction you have imagined? Please write 1 to 5 sentences describing your feelings about the interaction you have imagined. Okay, so in the first treatment, you're asked to look down and think about people lower on the income ladder, okay, and then how you think an interaction might go with them. And then you're asked to think about people higher up on the income ladder and how you think that social interaction might go in a getting acquainted situation, okay? Then they ask questions about social policy preferences. So how much do you agree with the following statements? Okay, now to be clear, this is not all of the possible questions you could ask, but I wanted to give you a sense of what they're looking for. It is the responsibility of the government to reduce the differences in income between people with high incomes and those with low incomes. Strongly agree to strongly disagree. Okay. Should federal spending on financial aid for college students be increased, decreased, or kept about the same? Increased, decreased, kept about the same. Should federal spending on Social Security be increased, decreased, or kept about the same? Increased, decreased, or kept about the same. So these first parts where they're asking people to imagine the ladder and whether they're looking up or down, that's our independent variable of theoretical interest. That's a social comparison, okay? Our dependent variable here is people's social policy preferences. And so what they're assessing is when you ask people to think about the rich and social interactions with them, and when you ask people to think about the poor and social interactions with them, how does that shape preferences for redistribution, right? Because these are all questions about redistribution. Should the government reduce differences in income between people with high incomes and those with low incomes? Should federal spending on financial aid for college students be increased, decreased, or kept about the same? That's redistribution. Federal spending on Social Security be increased, decreased, or kept about the same. That's redistribution. They also ask about food stamps, food stamps and welfare, I believe too. So, but this isn't all the questions, but I wanted you to get a sense. The dependent variable here is preferences for redistribution. So what they find is that if you look here, the upward comparison is here, the control where they're not asked to look up or down the ladder, and then a downward comparison where they're asked to look down the ladder. That was the first treatment. So when people were asked to do the upward comparison, so that to the wealthy, right? The upward comparison is think about the wealthy, having a social interaction with them, and then asking them, how do you feel about redistribution? People who were asked to do an upward comparison to the wealthy, that increased support for redistribution. So when people thought about the wealthy, they largely increased support for more redistribution. And they did that with the redistributive spending scale here. But then they also did it, if you look here, there's Social Security, college aid, food stamps, and unemployment. When people were asked to do the upward comparison to the wealthy, you can see that for college aid, food stamps, and unemployment, they all, like, I know you might be having trouble reading this graph, but just to give you a hint about what it's about, when people were asked to do an upward comparison, as opposed to a downward comparison, which is these here, you see that they go upward comparison, control, downward comparison, upward, control, downward. When people were asked to do upward comparisons for college aid, food stamps, and unemployment, you can see that these had positive effects, right? They're above this zero line here. In other words, when individuals were asked to do an upward comparison towards the wealthy, that increased their likelihood of supporting redistribution for college aid, food stamps, and unemployment. Okay? So thinking about the wealthy increased support for redistribution. Okay. Now, the strengths of experiments is that causal inference is much, much easier. Okay. We know that Y isn't causing X because we were the ones who assigned X's values. Okay. So we know that our independent variable causes our dependent variable. Since randomization makes both groups identical and therefore controls for other confounders. Okay. Remember how we talked about the Guess Who characters, right? Maria and Anne, right, they're randomly assigned, and we had even distributions of people with hats, people with beards, people with glasses, right? We've controlled for all of those other confounders, okay? And instead, the thing that we have control over is the treatment or the placebo, okay? Now, the weakness, though, is that we can only study some kind of phenomena. So we can't, for instance, we can't assign people different races, right? I can't be like, what is the effect of race on redistribution or redistributive attitudes? I can't be like, well, individual 1, I need them to be black, and individual 2, I'm going to assign them to be white. That doesn't work, okay? We also, the same is true of a lot of things, a lot of research about countries, right? We can't assign some countries to be a democracy and others be authoritarian. They're either authoritarian or they're democracies on their own, right? We don't get control over that. The other problem is that many experiments rely on non-representative samples. We don't have a survey institute here, but in a lot of universities, they pilot surveys on college students to start, and then they will field the survey in a much more broad sense later on. And a real question here is, how representative are college students of the general population, right? If you're only asking people who are 18 to 22 their opinions on things, that might not hold for the entire population that is 22 and older, okay? And then finally, are the treatments themselves realistic? Okay. Oftentimes the treatments are not necessarily realistic and the effects wouldn't necessarily hold in the real world. Okay. So what we covered, you should be able to understand the difference now between observational data, which is what is used with regression analyses, and experimental data, which is what we talked about today. Okay. Finally, you should know about the conditions of experiments, and this video should have given you a better sense of what the experiment looked like from our reading for today. If you have any questions about this, or if you're curious about how to do this for your own research, please let me know.